Have you ever prayed, begged, or cried out to God and felt nothing but silence in return? This is a story of a believer overwhelmed by unanswered prayers, storms, and confusion, yet refusing to turn away. From the weight of despair to the raw cries of the heart, from sleepless nights to trembling surrender, each chapter reveals a journey of trust forged in the darkest moments. Through tears, doubt, and the silence of God, a fragile faith grows stronger, and the believer discovers that his silence was never absence. Witness a transformative journey where in the quiet hours of early morning, a believer reportedly awoke with a weight heavier than anything they had carried before. Sources close to the situation describe an atmosphere thick with confusion, as though the events of recent days had collided into a single, overwhelming moment. Despite countless prayers whispered in desperation, no clear answers had emerged, raising growing concern among those who have followed the believer's spiritual journey closely. Witnesses say the sudden storms that struck their life, unexpected losses, emotional turmoil, and unanswered questions have left the believer standing at a crossroads without direction. The once familiar rhythm of faith had been disrupted, replaced by a haunting uncertainty that made even simple decisions feel impossible. Observers remarked on the visible exhaustion etched across the believer's face as they sat on the edge of the bed, struggling to steady their breath. Analysts monitoring the situation report that the silence of God seemed to echo through the room with a volume that was almost deafening. It wasn't anger or rebellion that filled the believer's heart, but a deep, aching confusion. It's like praying into a void, one close source shared, describing the emotional struggle playing out behind the scenes. You keep speaking, but heaven just feels so quiet. Despite the storm swirling inside, something remarkable happened. According to those who witnessed the moment, instead of turning away, the believer whispered a statement that has since become central to the unfolding story. "Lord, I don't understand, but I'm still here." It was a fragile declaration, part prayer, part plea, part surrender, yet it carried surprising strength. Experts in spiritual resilience suggest that such moments often mark the beginning of a deeper breakthrough. When everything feels dark and disorienting, choosing to remain present before God becomes a powerful act of faith. In this case, the believer's steady whisper in the midst of confusion signaled that the story was far from over. As the morning light slowly crept across the room, the believer reportedly closed their eyes and allowed the heaviness to settle, not as defeat, but as an invitation to trust beyond understanding. Observers anticipate that this emotional turning point will shape the chapters ahead, setting the stage for a transformative journey that has only just begun. Following the tense emotional atmosphere reported in Chapter 1, new details emerged this morning, revealing that the believer's quiet whisper of surrender was only the beginning of a deeper internal battle. After waking overwhelmed and admitting they did not understand what God was doing, insiders say the believer's heart reached a breaking point. What began as a single whisper confession reportedly flew into a raw, unfiltered cry that shook the calm of dawn. Sources close to the situation described the moment as intense and deeply human. Unable to contain the weight any longer, the believer began to pray, not with practiced words or polished phrases, but with trembling honesty. Something shifted. One witness explained, "It wasn't just a prayer. It was a cry from the depths of someone who has run out of strength." The emotional pressure that had silently built through unanswered prayers finally erupted like a long-suppressed storm. Observers watching from nearby reported that the believer's voice cracked with desperation as they confessed their fears aloud. Questions spilled out, "Why is this happening? Where are you, Lord? What am I supposed to do now?" Each question carried the force of deep confusion, yet also a plea for God to intervene. Specialists in spiritual trauma note that such moments often reflect the soul wrestling between despair and hope. As the prayer intensified, analysts observed a growing vulnerability in the believer's tone. No longer hiding their uncertainty, they laid bare every hurt, disappointment, and hidden wound. Reports indicate that tears streamed freely as the believer admitted feelings they had long tried to ignore. Fear of the unknown, exhaustion from constant battles, and frustration over God's silence. The scene was described as both heartbreaking and sacred. In a dramatic turn, those monitoring the situation noticed that the believer began shifting from lament to surrender. Instead of demanding an explanation, they started pleading for strength to endure the unexplained. "Hold me, Lord. I cannot hold myself," they cried. Experts say cries like these reveal the soul's instinctive desire to cling to God even when understanding fails. Meanwhile, spiritual analysts commented on the striking contrast between the chaos inside the believer's heart and the stillness around them. The room remained quiet, yet the atmosphere grew heavy with an almost tangible presence. Some witnesses claimed there was a sense, subtle but undeniable, that heaven was listening, even if God had not yet spoken. By mid-morning, a remarkable development took place. The believer, though visibly shaken, continued praying despite the emotional exhaustion pressing against their voice. This persistence, according to faith researchers, marks a critical milestone. Praying through pain rather than around it, it suggests a heart that refuses to give up even when clarity has not yet come. Observers report that as the believer's prayers slowed, their tone shifted once again, this time toward a trembling hope. "Lord, please don't leave me," they whispered. Though the prayer was fragile, it carried surprising resilience, like a small flame refusing to be extinguished by the surrounding storm. Psychological analysts familiar with spiritual crises say that such vulnerable moments often become turning points in a person's faith journey. When someone dares to speak their deepest truths before God, they step into a place where healing can begin. For this believer, today's raw cry may later be remembered not as a moment of collapse, but as a first step toward restoration. As the reporting concludes for Chapter 2, one thing is clear. The believer's heart has entered profound spiritual struggle, yet the cry that rose from the depths shows they have not given up. Their plea has set the stage for what many expect to be a dramatic unfolding in the next chapter, when the silence of God will either deepen their crisis or prepare them for breakthrough. Following the emotional eruption reported in Chapter 2, new developments reveal that the believer's powerful cry did not bring the immediate relief many hoped for. Instead, insiders say an unsettling stillness settled over the room, thick enough to feel like a wall. After pouring out their heart with raw honesty, the believer waited, eyes closed, hands trembling, hoping for even the faintest sense of divine response. But moments passed, then minutes, and heaven remained silent. Witnesses described this silence as far more intense than the emotional storm that came before it. It wasn't an ordinary quiet, one observer explained. It felt like the silence grew heavier with every passing second, like a weight pressing down on the believer's spirit. Analysts report that this stillness created a new kind of tension, sharper, colder, and more piercing than confusion of earlier chapters. Sources close to the situation say the believer's face shifted from raw desperation to deep distress. Having released everything they carried, they expected comfort or clarity or even a whisper of reassurance. Instead, the unanswered questions seemed to echo even louder and quiet. It's like their soul reached out and touched only emptiness, one source commented. The lack of response intensified the emotional crisis unfolding in real time. Experts monitoring the situation noted that doubt began creeping in almost immediately. The believer's eyes opened slowly, scanning the stillness as though searching for a sign that wasn't there. Eyewitnesses reported fragments of whispered thoughts drifting from their lips. Thoughts shaped by fear. Did God hear me? Why won't he speak? The internal battle, already fierce, grew more volatile by the moment. As the silence deepened, spiritual analysts observed the believer wrestling with thoughts they had long pushed aside. Memories of past disappointments resurfaced, fueling questions about whether God was truly near or if he had pulled away. Specialists in faith crises warn that such moments can become pivotal. The soul stands at a dangerous crossroads, torn between surrender and retreat. Despite the rising tension, something surprising happened. Instead of turning away in frustration, the believer remained frozen in place, still sitting, still breathing, still waiting. Witnesses report that this stubborn refusal to leave the moment signaled a quiet, hidden strength. It's like they were saying, "Even if I feel nothing, I won't walk away." An eyewitness shared. But psychologists observing the scene noted another layer to the drama. The believer's silence began to mirror God's silence. Their tears slowed, their breathing steadied. A strange stillness settled inside them, almost as if their spirit recognized that not all silence is abandonment. Sometimes it is preparation. This marked a significant shift in the atmosphere of the room. Reports indicate that the believer eventually lowered their head, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. They whispered a statement that immediately caught analysts' attention. "Lord, even your silence is hard for me to understand." This confession, though small, revealed a deepening awareness that trust becomes most real when answers are absent. In the final moment of the chapter's unfolding events, witnesses describe the believer placing a hand over their chest, as if trying to steady the trembling inside. No breakthrough followed, no sudden revelation, but observers insist something was changing beneath the surface, something invisible, intangible, but undeniably present. Following the suffocating stillness reported in Chapter 3, new developments this morning reveal a profound shift in the spiritual atmosphere surrounding the believer. Though God's silence continued without explanation, insiders say something unexpected began stirring. Not around the believer, but within them, after sitting motionless in that heavy quiet. Sources report the believer sensed a subtle pull, a gentle prompting that felt less like an answer and more like an invitation. Witnesses describe the moment as fragile but unmistakable. The believer lifted their head slowly, as though something unseen was calling for their attention. Analysts observing the scene insist that nothing physically changed. The room remained still, the air quiet, but the believer's posture transformed. What had been slumped shoulders and a defeated gaze now showed the faintest spark of awareness, as if their spirit recognized a whisper the ears could not hear. Insiders familiar with the believer's internal struggles say this shift was not rooted in relief or revelation, but in surrender. After enduring waves of doubt, fear, and divine silence, the believer realized they were being drawn toward a deeper decision, one far more difficult than asking questions, choosing to trust without answers. This realization reportedly sent a tremor of tension through their heart, heightening the drama unfolding within the room. Eyewitnesses report the believer pressing a hand against their chest as though steadying themselves for an unseen battle. Their breathing quickened. Their eyes filled again, not with desperation this time, but with the weight of a choice almost too heavy to make. Specialists in spiritual resilience emphasize that this is a defining moment in many faith journeys, when understanding ends and trust must begin. As internal conflict intensified, sources say the believer whispered into the silence, not with frustration, but with trembling vulnerability. "Lord, if you won't explain it, then teach me to trust you in it." Analysts immediately noted the significance of this shift. For the first time in this unfolding crisis, the believer's words did not ask for clarity or escape. They asked for faith. The request carried emotional gravity that marked a turning point. Observers reveal that soon after this fragile prayer, the believer's entire demeanor softened. Shoulders relaxed. Breath steadied. It was as though surrender itself released a quiet resilience, even as circumstances remained unchanged. The silence of God no longer felt like a wall. It now felt like a place where trust was being shaped, thread by thread. It wasn't comfort, one witness reported. It was courage, a quiet, trembling courage. Psychological analysts following the situation commented that choosing trust under uncertainty can create surprising internal stabilization. According to their assessment, the believer's willingness to stop fighting for control allowed space for peace to begin building, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. This internal shift, they say, signals that the believer is no longer resisting the unknown, but learning to stand within it. Still, the tension did not disappear. Sources confirm that the believer's eyes remained damp with unshed tears. Trusting God without explanations was not a moment of triumph, but a painful surrender. The believer's voice broke as they murmured, "I don't know where this is going, but I want to follow you, even blind." Witnesses describe the atmosphere turning thick with emotion, as though heaven itself paused to acknowledge the weight of that confession. Specialists in spiritual formation argue that such vulnerability often marks the beginning of deep transformation. Trust forged in darkness, they explain, becomes stronger than trust formed in light. This chapter illustrates that reality vividly. The believer did not receive answers, solutions, or miracles, but they received direction. And the direction was simple, quiet, and incredibly demanding. Trust me. In the aftermath of the believer's trembling surrender reported in Chapter 4, new updates confirm a dramatic, yet gentle turn in the unfolding spiritual narrative. Following the fragile declaration, Teach me to trust you even blind. Sources say the atmosphere around the believer shifted again, this time with a quiet clarity. Though the silence of heaven remained, insiders report that the believer's mind began unexpectedly drifting toward memories long buried under the weight of recent confusion. Witnesses close to the situation described this development as subtle but powerful. As the believers sat in the same room where they had wrestled with fear in silence, images of past moments of divine faithfulness began surfacing. It was like watching someone suddenly remember light while still standing in darkness. One observer shared, "The memories did not come with force, but with the gentleness of a hand guiding a trembling heart." According to analysts, the first memory that surfaced involved a time years ago when the believer had faced another difficult season, and God had stepped in at the very last moment. Insiders report this recollection hit the believer with surprising emotional force, reminding them that silence in the present does not erase rescue in the past. "You brought me through that," the believer whispered, voice cracking with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. More memories followed. Unexpected breakthroughs, answered prayers, impossible doors that opened, and storms that once seemed unbeatable. Witnesses say the believer's expression slowly shifted from despair to quiet astonishment as the pattern became clear. God had never abandoned them, not once. Each memory served as undeniable evidence that the present silence did not equal divine absence. Spiritual analysts monitoring the scene emphasize at this stage, remembering, is often a turning point in deep faith crises. Fear thrives in forgetfulness, they explain, but trust grows when the soul deliberately remembers who God has been. For this believer, the recollections began stitching together a narrative stronger than the storm they were currently facing. Insiders reveal that at one point, the believer placed both hands over their face as tears flowed again, not from confusion, but from recognition. "You were faithful every time," they murmured, as though rediscovering a truth they once clung to but had lost in the fog of unanswered questions. Witnesses described the moment as emotionally overwhelming, the kind of realization that stops a person mid-breath. Psychologists observing the situation have noted that memory often functions as a stabilizing anchor during emotional upheaval. By reconnecting with past experiences of rescue and provision, the believer began regaining internal balance. A fragile but undeniable calm settled in their posture, replacing the trembling vulnerability of earlier chapters with a quiet understanding. If God did not fail then, he will not fail now. Yet the scene was not without intensity. Reports indicate that the believer wrestled briefly with a lingering question. If he was faithful before, why does he feel so silent now? Witnesses say the question did not carry the same desperation as before. Instead, it reflected a heart trying to reconcile truth with experience. Analysts suggest this tension is natural and even necessary for authentic trust to grow. In a dramatic resolution to the chapter, the believer lifted their eyes toward the ceiling with a soft, shaken smile. Following the powerful emotional shift documented in Chapter 5, where the believer remembered God's past faithfulness, new developments reveal an even deeper transformation unfolding. Despite circumstances that have not changed outwardly, insiders report that something profound is shifting internally. What was once paralyzing fear has begun turning into a quiet readiness, a willingness to move forward even without clear direction. Witnesses describe the scene as startling in contrast to earlier chapters. The room that felt heavy with confusion now appeared to hold a different weight, one not of despair, but of determination. The believer sat upright, shoulders squared slightly, as if preparing for something unseen. Analysts suggest that this posture reflects a significant internal decision, to walk by faith despite the chaos that's around them. Sources close to the situation reveal that the believer spoke aloud again, this time not in despair or pleading, but with a steady tone. "God, I will trust you, even without answers." The statement, simple yet resolute, sent ripples through those observing the moment. Spiritual specialists classify this as a turning point, where faith shifts from emotional reaction to intentional action. However, the scene quickly intensified. Insiders report that almost immediately after the believer's declaration, the familiar chaos of their circumstances seemed to rush back into their mind, like waves crashing into newly built walls. Doubts whispered sharply. Fears resurfaced with renewed force, reminding the believer of unanswered prayers, unresolved problems, and the silence that had stretched to the previous hours. Witnesses say the believer closed their eyes tightly, visibly shaken by the sudden internal onslaught. But surprisingly, instead of collapsing under the pressure as before, the believer stood firm. The difference was unmistakable, one observer noted. Fear came just as fiercely, but this time it didn't take them down. Analysts attribute this resilience to the foundation laid in Chapter 5, remembering who God is. In a dramatic moment that captured the attention of every observer, the believer spoke again, louder and more confident than before. My feelings are screaming, but my faith is louder. Those present described the declaration as electrifying, an act of spiritual defiance against the chaos. It marked the first time in this unfolding journey that the believer chose trust, not because circumstances eased, but precisely because they hadn't. Psychological experts studying the incident noted that the believer's internal battle mirrors a common truth. Faith is rarely forged in comfort, but in conflict. The decision to stand firm in chaos, they explain, builds resilience that emotion alone cannot sustain. And in this case, the believer's steadying resolve appeared to grow with each passing moment. As tensions continue to rise, insiders report the believer taking a slow, deliberate breath, an act small in appearance but massive in significance. They whispered, God, guide me step by step, even if I only see one step at a time. Analysts highlight that this shift, from demanding clarity to accepting incremental guidance, represents maturity emerging from struggle. As the chapter neared its conclusion, witnesses observed a powerful scene. The believer rose to their feet. It was not a dramatic leap or a triumphant gesture, but a quiet, symbolic act of readiness. Standing in the same room where they had once been overwhelmed by confusion and silence, the believer now embodied a posture of faith, steady, willing, and expectant. Following the powerful decision to stand in faith reported in Chapter 6, dramatic new developments indicate that the atmosphere surrounding the believer shifted in ways witnesses describe as undeniably supernatural. For hours, the believer had walked through silence, confusion, and emotional storms, yet remained steadfast. And now, sources confirm that subtle signs of divine activity began surfacing, signaling that heaven was no longer still. According to insiders, the first sign was almost imperceptible. While standing in quiet surrender, the believers suddenly felt a warmth spread through their chest, gentle, steady, unmistakable. Witnesses report that the believer froze, breath catching, as the warmth grew stronger, like a hand resting over their heart. Analysts on the scene clarified that nothing in the environment changed physically, suggesting this sensation originated from a spiritual source. Observers say the believer's eyes filled with fresh tears, but not of fear this time. These tears, according to those present, reflected something new, relief. After chapters of silence, doubt, and chaos, the believer finally sensed presence. It wasn't a voice, one witness said. It wasn't an answer, but it was him, and that was enough to break the atmosphere wide open. As the presence grew, insiders report that a remarkable calm washed through the room. Every whisper of fear, every echo of unanswered questions, seemed to lose strength. The believer's shoulders relaxed, their breathing slowed, and for the first time in this unfolding journey, peace, not forced, not imagined, entered the scene. Specialists note that this shift marks a critical point, where faith meets divine response. However, analysts emphasize that God still did not speak in words. Instead, he began moving in ways that touched the believer's spirit more deeply than explanations ever could. Witnesses describe the moment as electric with quiet power, an invisible reassurance that though God had been silent, he had never been absent. It felt like dawn breaking, one observer reported. Sources close to the incident reveal that the believer whispered something barely audible. "You're here. You're really here." The statement carried profound emotional weight. After walking through the darkness with trembling trust, the believer had finally reached the moment their faith anticipated, the realization that God had been working beneath the silence all along. Soon after, insiders say the believer felt prompted, once again not by an audible voice, but by an internal nudge to release the heaviness they had been carrying for so long. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. Witnesses report the believer inhaled deeply as if preparing for something monumental, and then exhaled with a trembling release. symbolically letting go of the fear, confusion, and need for control. Psychological experts analyzing the moment emphasize that such releases often mark the beginning of emotional restoration. Faith had prepared the ground. Trust had opened the heart, and now peace was beginning to settle roots where turmoil once lived. Observers noted that the believer's entire countenance changed, no longer weighed down, but lifted, strengthened, renewed, in a dramatic emotional turn. The believer began softly repeating a phrase that carried both gratitude and awe. "Thank you. Even when I didn't see it, you were moving." Each repetition grew steadier, stronger, as though the believer was reclaiming truth that had nearly been lost in the earlier chaos. Witnesses describe the atmosphere as thick with holy comfort, following the unprecedented surge of divine presence documented in Chapter 7. Dramatic new developments reveal that the believer has now entered the long-awaited moment of revelation. After days of confusion, hours of silence, and a journey marked by surrender and trust, insiders confirm that God finally responded. Not with thunder, not with spectacle, but with a voice that carried the weight of eternity and the tenderness of a father. Witnesses report that the moment began quietly. The believer, still standing in the glow of newfound peace, felt the warmth in their chest intensify, slowly, steadily, until it seemed to overflow. Analysts observing the atmosphere said the air itself felt charged, as if something sacred was preparing to unfold. The believer's eyes widened, breath caught, heart stilled. Then it happened. According to sources closest to the scene, a voice, not audible to the room but unmistakable within the believer's spirit, broke through the silence that had haunted them for so long. It was clear. It was calm. It was overwhelmingly gentle. "My child," the voice said, "I never left you." Witnesses described the believer collapsing to their knees with a sob that echoed through the room. Insiders report that the believer shook violently, not out of fear, but from a force of relief washing over them. After chapters of pleading, questioning, and trembling in uncertainty, the clarity of God's words shattered the internal storm. Specialists in spiritual experiences noted that the believer's response indicated the moment carried deep healing power, the kind that rewrites the heart from the inside out. The voice continued, according to detailed accounts. Every silent moment had purpose. Every unanswered prayer was shaping you. Every tear you cried watered the ground where your faith would grow. Analysts say these words reframe the entire journey. What once felt like abandonment was now revealed as preparation. What felt like emptiness was revealed as divine intentionality. Observers reported an emotional breakdown unlike anything seen in previous chapters. The believer covered their face, sobbing uncontrollably as the weight of truth collided with their weary heart. Insiders noted that the presence in the room grew almost tangible, compassionate, comforting, protective. It felt like heaven leaned close. One witness said, "The revelation deepened as God spoke again. You wanted answers. I wanted to give you strength. You wanted clarity. I wanted to give you trust. You wanted escape. I wanted to give you endurance." Each statement struck the believer with visible force, shaping the climax of this spiritual journey. Analysts emphasize that such clarity rarely comes without the crucible that precedes it. As a believer knelt in awe, they whispered repeatedly, "I didn't know. I didn't know." Their voice trembled, yet carried a tone of worship. Observers say this moment marked a turning point from brokenness to restoration, a powerful shift in which the believer's wounds became windows for divine truth to shine through. Sources confirm that God concluded with a final, defining statement. "Now you will walk not by what you feel, but by who I am." The word sealed a revelation, anchoring the believer not in circumstances, but in God's character, a theme that had been building from the earliest chapters. As the chapter and the journey reaches its emotional peak, analysts agree that this moment fulfills everything the believer endured: the confusion, the silence, the storm, the surrender, the trust. It all led here to the voice that finally broke the darkness. Witnesses describe a believer rising slowly to their feet, eyes overflowing but steady, heart finally at peace. The fragile surrender born at dawn did not erase the believer's struggles. Instead, it exposed a deeper layer of vulnerability. As the day unfolded, waves of emotion crashed again. Questions resurfaced. Fears whispered louder, and the old confusion tried to reclaim its throne. The believer felt the trembling tension between surrender and sorrow, wondering if trust was truly enough to carry them through another storm. By midday, the familiar heaviness returned, settling on the believer's chest like a weight made of unanswered prayers. The silence of God, which earlier felt sacred, now felt suffocating again. Lord, why do you speak to others so clearly, yet remain quiet with me? The question escaped like a wounded cry, slicing through the stillness of the room. It was not rebellion, it was heartbreak. The believer fell to their knees once more, the wooden floor cold and unforgiving beneath them. Tears streamed freely, not from despair, but from the exhausting cycle of believing, waiting, hoping, and breaking. Chapter 8 surrender had been real, but surrender didn't eliminate the ache. It intensified it, because now the believer's heart was wide open, unshielded, exposed. As the sobs slowed, the believer remained on the floor, breathing unsteadily. It was there, in that stripped-down, raw silence, that something unexpected occurred. A thought, gentle yet firm, pressed into the believer's spirit. My silence was never absence. It wasn't a voice heard with ears, but felt with the soul, and it pierced deeper than any thunderous miracle ever could. The believer froze. The moment wasn't loud or dramatic. It felt like a whisper carried on the edge of a breeze, yet it hit with the force of revelation. The tears shifted, no longer desperate, but stunned. For days, the believer begged for answers, clarity, direction. But what God offered in this quiet interruption was relationship, presence, assurance. Rising slowly from the floor, the believer felt warmth spreading through their chest. Not the warmth of emotion alone, but the warmth of finally realizing something they had resisted. God was not waiting for them to be strong. He was waiting for them to fall into his arms. The silence had been a teacher, not a rejection. A setup, not a punishment. The believer approached the window again, just as they had in the previous chapter. But this time the view felt transformed. The street outside was still ordinary, the sky still gray, the world still spinning, but now everything shimmered with a hidden comfort. Nothing outside had changed, but something inside had undeniably shifted. The believer whispered into the quiet room, hands trembling, Lord, I still don't understand, but maybe I don't have to. The words broke something and healed something. It felt like letting go of the last bit of resistance, the final grip of fear, the lingering belief that trust required full understanding. Then, a memory poured into the believer's mind with sudden force, moments where God had protected them without their knowledge, doors he had closed that later proved to be mercy, storms he had carried them through even when they thought they were alone. The pattern became clear. God had been speaking all along, not through explanations, but through faithfulness. As night began to fall, the believer sat quietly, no longer demanding answers, but embracing the mystery of God's timing. The storm wasn't over. The path wasn't clear. But for the first time, the believer felt anchored, steadied not by understanding, but by trust. And that trust, fragile but real, became the bridge into the final chapter, where God's purpose would finally begin to unfold. The night settled gently after the emotional upheaval of the day, but the believer remained awake, replaying the quiet revelation that had cracked open their hardened confusion. God's silence was never his absence. That truth echoed like a steady heartbeat, and though the believer still carried bruises from the long season of uncertainty, something inside had begun to steady. The darkness around them didn't feel as thick as before, almost as if a thin veil of light had begun to slip through the edges. Morning came with soft gold filtering through the curtains, painting the room with warmth. The believer sat up slowly, the exhaustion still present, but no longer dominating. Instead, there was a profound sense of being carried, held by a presence that had been there all along. The surrender from Chapter 8 and the heart-healing moment from Chapter 9 now mingled into a quiet expectancy. Something was shifting in the unseen, even if the believer couldn't articulate it yet. The believer prepared for the day, noticing the absence of panic that usually gripped their chest. Worry still whispered, but they no longer held the same authority. Step by step, breath by breath, trust was becoming more than a desperate choice. It was becoming a posture, a way of walking. The believer whispered a prayer that felt strangely steady. Lord, guide me, even if all I see is fog. As they moved through the house, the believer sensed a new kind of awareness. Every small detail, every still moment felt meaningful. Even the silence of the morning no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, like the world was preparing to reveal something. The believer felt themselves slowing down, listening deeper, watching with a heart half broken but wholly open. A sudden heaviness entered the moment, not from fear, but from realization. Trusting God required giving up the illusion of control, and that surrender was still ongoing. Memories of old disappointments flickered like shadows. Times when doors slammed shut. Times when nothing made sense. Times when prayers felt like unanswered echoes. Yet each memory was met with a new whisper. I was there. Emotion rose again, but this time it wasn't despair. It was grief giving way to gratitude. The believer felt tears forming, but they were different from the tears of previous chapters. These tears were cleansing, healing, untangling knots of doubt that had tightened around the heart for far too long. The believer pressed a hand to their chest, overwhelmed by the realization that God had been faithful in ways they had never recognized. Stepping outside, the believer noticed the sky was still overcast but carried a hint of brightness, as if the sun was waiting for the right moment to break through. The air felt fresh, and a gentle breeze brushed the believer's face, stirring something deep inside. It felt like a sign, not necessarily the storm ending, but a hope rising within the storm itself. As the believer walked down the familiar path toward the gate, their steps felt different, not lighter, but steadier. The burden hadn't disappeared, but the believer no longer carried it alone. God's silence from earlier chapters had turned into a quiet companionship, and that companionship began shaping every thought, every fear, every hesitation. A realization struck with surprising force. The believer might never understand everything God was doing, but understanding was no longer the goal. Trust was, relationship was, surrender was. And for the first time, the believer embraced the truth that God's guidance often began not with clarity, but with trust given in the darkest places. By the time the day was fully underway, the believer sensed it unmistakably. This was the beginning of a turning point. The fog hadn't fully lifted, but cracks of light were forming. A shift in the atmosphere, a stirring in the spirit. Not an ending, but a beginning of redemption. Something was unfolding, something the believer had longed for but never expected to see. And this time, the believer was finally ready to walk into it. The quiet shift that began the previous morning deepened as the believer moved through the day. It started subtly, a peace that couldn't be explained, a strength that didn't make sense. The believer felt as though heaven had reached down and placed a hand on their trembling heart, steadying each beat. The storm in life hadn't changed, but something inside had undeniably awakened, something that whispered, "Watch, something is coming." As afternoon settled in, the believer found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, the confusion of chapter 1, the collapse of hope, the endless pleading, the nights soaked in tears, the battle between surrender and frustration. Each chapter of the struggle had carved something deep into the soul. Now, those pieces began aligning like puzzle fragments, slowly revealing a hidden picture. It was as if God had been weaving meaning through every heartbreak. The believer sat quietly at the table, tracing the rim of a mug with shaking fingers. Out of nowhere, a memory flashed, one they had long buried. A moment from years ago when a prayer went unanswered, and they thought God had abandoned them. But now, with new clarity, they saw the truth. If that prayer had been answered, they would have walked into disaster. Protection had looked like silence back then, too. Suddenly, patterns they had missed began emerging everywhere. The realization came like a rush of wind. God had been speaking all along, just not in the language the believer expected. His voice was woven into delays, into redirections, into the very storms that once felt cruel. It hit with breathtaking force. He had been guiding the believer through confusion, not around it. The believer's chest tightened as the weight of understanding pressed in, but this time was not a crushing weight. It was a holy one. As emotions swelled, the believer felt compelled to step outside, drawn by an urge they couldn't explain. The sky was still cloudy, but now there were slivers of sunlight piercing through like blades of hope cutting the gray apart. The breeze carried a strange sweetness, a sense of anticipation that stirred the believer's spirit. Something was shifting, not metaphorically, but tangibly. Suddenly, the believer's phone buzzed, a message they weren't expecting, from someone they hadn't spoken to in years. The words on the screen felt unreal, almost divinely timed. It wasn't a full answer, not yet, but it was the first piece of clarity the believer had desperately prayed for. A lead, a direction, a spark of confirmation. The believer stood frozen, hands trembling. Sensing this moment wasn't accidental, it was orchestrated. The revelation hit harder because of everything that had come before. If this message had arrived weeks earlier, in the middle of confusion and spiritual panic, the believer might have dismissed it or misunderstood it. But now, after surrender, after silence, after the slow healing, this small sign felt monumental. It felt like God whispering, "See, I was working even when you saw nothing." Tears welled, but they were different from every chapter before. These tears carried awe, relief, wonder. The believer leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by how perfectly God's timing aligned what the heart could finally handle. It wasn't that God had delayed the answer. It was that the believer had needed preparation to receive it. As the evening light dimmed, the believer sensed it again, that swelling in the spirit, that gentle pull that had begun in chapter 10. But now it was stronger, clearer, almost electric. Clarity hadn't fully formed, but the foundation was laid. God was about to reveal more. The believer could feel it like a vibration in the soul. By nightfall, the believer sat near the window once more, staring at the darkening sky with a heart no longer pleading for explanations, but bracing for revelation. Something holy was unfolding.